The script for this video was proofread by believers from various religions. We hope to create a thought experiment that is as neutral as possible and hopefully will contribute to a better understanding and bettering communication. The war in Ukraine has been raging for almost 3 years, while its defeat is now becoming more and more apparent. Please see our regarding episode if of interest to you. But Putin's influence is also crumbling at every corner. After the defeat and escape of Syria's ruler Assad, another domino of Russia's international allies has fallen. This as it already recently lost the respect of its own security alliance, as it seemed unable to mediate, let alone stop the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Behind all of these Russian losses, however, there is a master strategist who is profiting from it all. So why is this video titled that Turkey will win the Ukraine war and possibly the Sunnah faith of Islam might win the world? Here's a brief overview of what we will be focusing on today. First, a very brief history of modern to postmodern Turkey. Second, the Erdogan era. Third, the military and economic advantages of modern Turkey. Fourth, international position, influence and power projection. Fifth, the Sunna-Shia, Kurd, Yazidi and conflict. Sixth, Hezbollah, Syria and Iran. Seventh, future scenario, why the Sunnah might lead the world. To get started right away, first, from the Ottoman Empire to Ataturk's Turkey of Enlightenment. After the defeat of the Axis powers in the First World War, as well as during it, the then already weakening Ottoman Empire lost practically all of its spheres of influence. It should give up even more than what we know today as core Turkey. All this after it already lost the provinces in the Balkans and Greece, which it had owned for centuries over the previous 19th century. A circumstance that the Young Turks and later Mustafa Kemal Atatürk were not willing to accept. They defied dictates from France and Great Britain and reconquered what is now their heartland, leaving hundreds of thousands of Pontic Greeks dead or forced to flee, with whom, by the way, they have a huge share of genetic relation. Second, President Erdogan was actually banned from politics in Turkey in his early years. In a state that was still clearly secular at the time, he openly represented and continues to represent Allah's mission in which, quote, "The mosques are our barracks, the minarets are our bayonets, and the believers are our soldiers." After a long return to politics, Erdogan's party and government succeeded step by step in achieving what is now virtually unchallenged rule. After an event which was internationally described as an attempted coup, then various lists appeared. These contained the names of hundreds of thousands of teachers, politicians, scientists and officers who were imprisoned at least for a short, but often for a long time to this day. One can deduce from this that modern Turkey in 2025 is firmly under Erdogan's practically total control. Third, power plant Turkey. Although the modern Turkish state has some economic problems, it is one of the states best positioned for the future in Europe as well as the Middle East. Turkey has an ever-modernizing arms industry whose quality improvements over the last few years I can confirm firsthand. Furthermore, it has one of the largest armies in the world, which also enjoys the advantage of being protected by Article 5 of NATO, but at the same time of being able to research weapons technology from all camps, including Russian air defense. Also, they clearly dominated the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict with the domestic drones, of which some models also went viral at the beginning of the Ukraine war. Also, I have the theory that countries that are not yet fully modern industrialized might have an advantage over longer industrialized nations in the event of a conflict. Improvisation skills and technical know-how are very much more widespread there still. If the existing industries were to be massively destroyed equally, for example, I would trust countries in which a lot of things were still Industry 1.0 to do better at least in the production of simple parts and general recoveries. This large army now also has large formations of associated forces, such as the Syrian regime, definitely Azerbaijan as a close ally, and has been fighting for a long time with its own foreign legions made up of, for example, Syrians in Libya, where we already saw the first uses of so-called loitering, lurking ammunition, patrolling autonomous killing drones. One should therefore assume that a Turkey of the present and the future will not only be in a more advantageous position demographically, but will also keep to be able to successfully navigate an increasingly multipolar order, keep domestic unrest to a minimum, and probably sustain up to 3 to 4 military campaigns in the Mediterranean and eastern regions. Not to mention what its diaspora could do on home fronts that might eventually become officially hostile. Fourth, striving for the restoration of a larger sphere of influence. There are various indications that President Erdogan is striving to restore at least parts of the old Ottoman Empire, or at least to massively expand the influence of the Turkish state, something he has been very successful at so far. Erdogan's greatest strength is his diplomatic chess-playing skill, playing others against each other, and ultimately exerting influence over the weakened parties. What benefits him today and in the long term is the young demographics of his population, as well as a huge Turkish diaspora around the world, which in Europe goes so far as to tempt him to say that no European is safe anymore if he were to command so. Here we come to another gamer speak, spawn, conquest point advantages of Turkey, which we'll come back to in our first animated episode, a complete history of geography, society and logistics, I think. Turkey controls the Bosporus, including Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, or Byzantium, which was conquered in 1453, whose streams of refugees then laid the foundations for the Renaissance in Europe, as well as to the discovery of America through the need of searching for an alternative Silk Road. With it, Turkey controls the bridge between Europe and Asia. Through rich sea route, huge shares of global food export from Ukraine and Russia are being transported. This gives Turkey enormous leverage over, for example, Egypt and many other Arab and African countries, which are overpopulated, at least relative to their self-sufficiency capabilities. Furthermore, an internationally recognized declaration protects against, for example, warships of certain tonnage being allowed to enter the Black Sea, where Russia and Ukraine have been at war for years and, among other things, have long since lost their flagships, even whole fleet in Ukraine's case. Fun fact, until the Crimean War, which many call World War 0.5, Crimea under the Tatars was the last major transshipment point for slaves stolen from Europe for the Muslim world, a significant aspect of why Russia started the war over it at the time. Fifth, the Sunna-Shia conflict. The Quran is the clear word of Mohammed and therefore Allah. Unlike parables and guidelines of other religions, God's literal statements cannot be changed, which is why many people fundamentally reject any kind of even mentioning a reformation. However, the following problems arise. A. Mohammed died without a clear male heir, which is why his father-in-law and son-in-law fought over the succession, with Abu Bakr, his father-in-law, prevailing and spearheading today's Sunnah confession. However, the Shiites, who are minorities and form the majority in some Middle Eastern states, as well as the government in Iran, believe in the rightful succession through the son-in-law, Ali. B. As I said, it is common to interpret the Quran as the direct and unchangeable word of God. Unfortunately, this raises not just one, but several fundamental problems, mind you, not questioning the former, but rather the following, asking for clarification from the audience, you valid viewer. C. So, the verses of the Quran and the Hadiths were initially passed on orally and remembered and recited from memory by an elite of believers, as is still proud tradition today. A fundamental problem that arises, however, is that after Muhammad's death, these rememberers, who formed their own elite military unit, were later massively decimated in a battle. Yet, the preservation of the Prophet's words in written form, having to be witnessed by at least 2 trustworthy remembrances, was not completely finished at this time. Which brings us to D. Released by rulers and the possible lost martyrs' memories. Yes, you always want to grant everyone the deepest piety and honor, but doesn't Allah himself say how weak, deceitful and unworthy people are when given the opportunity, and don't the well-intentioned people experience this again and again? Can we therefore 100% rule out the possibility that some things were perhaps no longer remembered because the specific remembrancer had fallen? Many second witnesses were now missing, or perhaps another inconsistency that was inconvenient to the ruler at the time was omitted, perhaps intentionally or simply through the former, possibly some which related to the completion of the House of Peace, for example referring to times like today, especially in the West where there is no longer any need to fear persecution, and the whole thing simply resolving itself peacefully over time due to birth rates, as we can already see today. Context. The Quran is divided into a peaceful phase in Mecca, in which the minority acted as peacefully and cooperatively as possible, and then the military expansion in the Medina part, from which all of much more aggressive verses come. Now, what some people call a problem is that in case of doubt, the verse that occurs later in the text prevails, which is why you are either faced with a constant ethical dilemma, or, as a consequence, one has to assume that violent expansion, conversion remains the ultimate goal, and in preparation for this, any kind of deception is permitted in weaker situations. Sixth, Syria, Hezbollah, and Iran. How quickly friendships or close relationships that have lasted for decades can change was already observed in the 90s in the Balkans, currently in Ukraine, and practically since the First World War ongoing in Turkey itself. Where Sunni nations such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia have managed to ally themselves with the West, after the fall of the Alawite Assad, Iran is now the last Shiite state in the focus of Israel and therefore the USA on the list.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon, and I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." He said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
The fall of Assad was massively due to the weakening of Hezbollah, which forced him to a recent peace agreement with Israel. As early as the 2010s, documentaries warned of many Sunni Shiite neighborhoods where conflicts would immediately break out if the patronage of Syria and Iran ceased. Much of this already may be underway. What is very interesting here is that Western media seem to be trying very hard not to portray the new leader of Syria, who was previously close to Al-Qaeda, in this context. The offensive was a clear move by Erdogan to allow his Sunni allies to control more areas. Some speculate, and it would only be strategically logical, in order to be able to deal directly with the stateless Kurds in the event that the new US president discontinued support, as they long have been a thorn in Turkish hinterland. Which brings us to 7th, a future scenario. The US-Israeli strategic short-sightedness or miscalculation, why the Sunnah might conquer the world. Now, let's assume that Iran falls in the coming years. A water war with the Taliban has long been looming for a long time. Saudi Arabia would always do everything possible to eliminate Tehran, and Tehran recently allied itself with the Armenians, which puts it face to face with Turkey and Israel, which support Azerbaijan. There are many ways to start a conflict, and there are even more interests in it. If Iran were to fall, as the last Shiite protecting power, the biggest remaining players, Türkiye and Saudi Arabia, would have a free hand, and all remaining Shiite militias might fall continuously. Turkey's next strategic stops would naturally be the Kurds and Armenia, both of which could break out as early as 2025. Please come back for our future conflicts episode. And once the greater Turkish hinterland is pacified and the large land bridge between the Turkic people is established, a northern expansion, at least in the sphere of influence, would probably be on the agenda. Erdogan himself emphasized that they would fight for the Caucasus, as their ancestors had done for a long time. Chechnya has already given Russia a huge headache, basically maintains its own military, for which it draws massive amounts of capital and recruits from the MMA scene, and provides these snipers and trainers for radical forces worldwide. While Russia has now eliminated itself demographically in the long term with its losses in Ukraine, at the same time it already has a 5th Muslim population, which could increase to a 3rd by the 2030s. Here too, the birth rates and average age are similarly advantageous, as in all Western countries as well. If war were to break out in the middle of the century, there would always be, for example, several young Turks for every one young Greek. How demographic developments will shape themselves over the next few decades could become decisive for many nations, if not even culturally existential in this form. While Russia has now created further factors that will cause it to break up in the medium term, while it is already losing Siberia via demographics to China. And here we come to the really dangerous scenarios. Both Russia and Israel have nuclear weapons, and both would have the opportunity to use them in the event of an impending state collapse, their people getting overrun. Especially Judaism has at least one religious reference, Kiddush Hashem, rather to die by own hand than grant the enemy the satisfaction, which might have happened in Worms, Germany, actually 2 times, once burning themselves in the houses to avoid the stake, being framed for the Black Death, and later by own blades, when members of a crusade repeatedly betrayed them. While Israel has now managed to make various of its neighboring states militarily ineffective or benevolent to grudgingly tolerant, a surrounded Russia that is facing its downfall could, on the one hand, allow nuclear bombs to fall into the hands of radical forces, or decide to use them in a final act of defiance to farewell the Rus with a memorable blast. Mind you, over the last year Israel has definitely identified deficiencies in its formation, doctrine and functionality under wartime conditions, and one could say that it has not fully achieved any of its objective in Gaza or Lebanon to date. Please see our regarding series on October 7th mistakes, as well as a regarding confirmation in a short interview. In Asia too, starting with the Philippines as the most populous Muslim nation in the world, moving on to an increasingly Muslim India, and an already nuclear-armed Pakistan, the demographic and cultural trends can hardly be dismissed. While the absolutely male-leaning unregulated immigration to the West has also shifted all balances here, so that the extent of a so-called youth bulge, which historically always brings with it civil wars at some point, has long since been reached. So we note, even without wars such as the rarely mentioned constant aggressions in Africa, especially Darfur, Abu Bakr is in triumphant march, and the founding and serious victories of Islamic parties in the West can probably be expected in the early 2030s. Once again the question arises, will the moderate youth trends in Islamic countries in the diaspora recognize and uphold the advantages of diversity and peaceful coexistence based on the Enlightenment and post-war model, or will the hardliners ultimately prevail, as is so often the case? Or, for example, will the Western elites at some point deviate from the idea that radical religious people are easier to control and realize that although a one world, one government is a nice utopia for combating global challenges, there are indications that at some point 99% Muslim forces will probably not keep following the one crypto-Jewish general in the long term. By the way, I am in full possession of my mental powers and have no intention and would never be able to delete myself. Just mentioning in today's episode's goodbye without any context. Finally, it should be mentioned here that the main difference between the states cooperating with the West and, for example, Iran is also between autocracy or monarchy versus theocracy. The former are globally cooperative and sometimes willing to compromise, while the absolutes of theocracies cannot be compromised on. As often, I hope that my thought experiments are completely wrong and that we all be surprised by a stable post-Mullah Iran and a cross-Middle East friendship and a Europe of melting pots falling into each other's arms. We'll see. Also, we hope to see you again soon. For example, on the holiday episode from December 22nd, in which we see some beautiful similarities between Turkic, Germanic and Indo-European people, at least visually mentioned. With this in mind, stay aware, take care, dear fellow human beings. Thank you for your attention. This concludes my elaborations.